There are cases in which files are kept not to be solved, but to be remembered. This is one of them. What you are about to hear comes from no work of fiction. It was not invented to frighten nor exaggerated to entertain. Every detail reconstructed here comes from official documents, parish records, time-yellowed letters, testimonies collected between 1896 and 1932, and from the deliberate silence of a man who, even while alive, vanished in a way science never fully knew how to explain. His name was Elias Voss, and in November of 1894 he returned from a war no one in that small town had asked to fight. The town of Harwick Creek lay in the interior of Ohio, wedged between oak-covered hills and a river whose name has been forgotten by modern maps. In 1894, it had a little over 900 residents, a single dirt main street, a pharmacy, a hardware store, a one-room schoolhouse, and a gray stone church that had stood there since 1831. Winter arrived early in that region, and October frosts already gilded the leaves before the harvesters finished their work in the fields. It was a town of quiet people who woke before sunrise, worked in silence, and slept with their windows shut. No one there was rich. No one there was completely poor. There was a particular dignity in that kind of place, the dignity of those who survive without having to ask. The Voss family was that kind of family. Heinrich Voss, Elias's father, had arrived from Prussia in 1857 with a wooden trunk, a worn covered Bible, and the large hands of someone who had learned to work since childhood. He bought a plot of land on the edge of town, built a 2-story pine house, still standing, according to county records, and raised 4 children with his wife Martha, who died of typhoid fever in 1888. Elias was the second child. Born in April of 1871, he was described in school records as quiet, attentive, a fast learner, and not inclined toward the company of the other boys. The school teacher, a man named George Aldrich, wrote in his personal journal, found decades later in a donation to the municipal library, that Elias was the kind of child you notice precisely because he seems to prefer not to be noticed. By the time he turned 18, Elias was already working the farm alongside his father. He was not a man of many words, but he wasn't cold either. The letters he wrote to his younger brother, August, survived in part, and they reveal a man capable of a restrained tenderness, dense and private, the kind that does not appear in public, but exists with a particular strength in intimacy. In February of 1892, Elias enlisted in the army. There was no declared war at that time. His enlistment was voluntary, motivated, according to a letter addressed to his father, kept for decades in the family dresser, and now digitized by the Morrow County Historical Archive, by a desire to see what exists beyond these hills before I'm too old to care. He was 21. He spent the next 2 years in training and minor detachments in the South. He did not enter real combat until the fall of 1893, when his unit was sent to a border region in the still unstable Northwest Territory, where skirmishes with indigenous groups and land disputes produced irregular conflicts that the newspapers of the time rarely covered accurately. What happened there, what Elias Voss saw, did, or witnessed between October of 1893 and August of 1894, was never fully documented. The military records of his unit, the 3rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Detachment, show a 4-month gap between December of 1893 and March of 1894. There are no field reports, no casualty records for that period. Only a single administrative note, written in pencil, nearly illegible on a sheet of paper whose provenance was never confirmed. Unit dispersed. Regrouping pending. Status of men uncertain. When Elias returned to Harwick Creek in November of 1894, he was alive. But something, and this is the point no testimony from that era could ever name with precision, something had come out with him from in there, or perhaps something had been left behind. Neighbors who saw him step down from the carriage on the main street that November day described years later the same impression. He looked like Elias, said Mary Kleinhans, who was a child at the time and was interviewed in 1928 by a local journalist, but he looked like Elias seen from very far away. like there was glass between him and the rest of the world. No one yet knew what that meant, but the file does not end with his return. The file ends, or rather stops speaking, on a night in March of 1896, and it is exactly here that the story begins. Because among the documents deposited at the Harwick Creek clerk's office in 1931, 35 years later, there is a cardboard box with the following identification handwritten on the lid: belongings of E. Voss. Found. Origin. Unknown. Inside the box there were 3 items: a pair of boots, their soles worn down to raw leather, a bone-handled knife, clean, no blood, no soil, no sign of recent use, and a photograph. The photograph showed Elias Voss seated on a wooden chair in front of a house no one in Harwick Creek ever identified. He looked directly at the camera. He wore civilian clothes. He looked well. The date written on the back of the photograph was March of 1896, the very month he had disappeared. To understand what happened to Elias Voss, you first have to understand what his life was. Not the life he had before the war. That, in parts, we already know. But the life he built, or tried to build, after he came back. Because there is a fundamental difference between surviving something and returning from it. And Elias Voss, as became clear in the months after his return, was a man who had survived, but he had not, in truth, returned. November of 1894. Harwick Creek was entering winter with its usual serenity. The harvests had been average, neither abundant nor disastrous. Families stocked firewood and preserves. Children went to school in wool scarves. Life followed its predictable course, that old rhythm small inland American towns knew so well. Wake, work, eat, sleep, pray on Sunday, begin again on Monday. It was into this world that Elias stepped down from the carriage. His father, Heinrich, went to meet him at the stop. The two walked back to the farm without exchanging many words, according to what August, the younger brother, told a local journalist in 1928. "My father was a man of few words too," August said, "so the silence between them didn't seem strange that first day. But over time I realized it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of men who don't need to talk. It was the silence of men who don't know how to begin." Elias returned to work on the farm within a week. He woke before dawn, fed the animals, cut wood, repaired fences. He did everything that needed doing in the proper order, without complaint and without being asked. Any outside observer would have said he was fine, that he had returned and was rebuilding routine, that the army had made him more disciplined. But there were details, small, specific details, the kind you only notice when you're paying attention for personal reasons. August noticed, for example, that his brother had stopped sleeping in the bedroom he'd slept in since childhood. During the first weeks, Elias made a straw mattress and set it up in the barn. When his father asked why, Elias said only that he preferred fresh air. Heinrich didn't press. It was winter, and the barn was cold, but Elias had returned from the army, and men who returned from the army sometimes needed things that didn't make sense to those who had stayed. There was also the matter of meals. Elias ate, but he ate like someone fulfilling an obligation, not taking pleasure. He sat at the table, served himself, chewed slowly, looked out the window most of the time. When conversation turned toward him, any question, any remark, he answered in short sentences, and then steered the topic back to work, to the weather, to a neighbor's harvest, to anything that wasn't himself. The first person outside the family to notice something was Mrs. Dorothea Meyer, owner of the pharmacy and the pastor's wife. She was an observant woman, the kind who watched people with a mixture of genuine curiosity and civic sense. In her diary, donated by her granddaughter to the Historical Archive in 1963, she wrote in January of 1895, 2 weeks after a brief encounter with Elias on the main street, "I met young Voss this morning. I asked how he was. He smiled, and it was exactly that smile that disturbed me. It was a proper smile, complete in form, but empty inside, like a lit room where no one lives." Dorothea Meyer was religious and practical. She did not reach for metaphors easily. When she chose one, it was because there was no other way to say it. Months passed. The spring of 1895 arrived damp and slow, as it often did in that region. Elias kept working, kept quiet, kept waking before dawn and going to the barn. And then in May of that year something changed. Elias began to leave. Not for town, not for the tavern, as other men his age did on weekends. He went out into the hills, alone, without telling anyone, sometimes for hours. Sometimes he returned before dinner. Sometimes he came back when the light had already vanished completely from the horizon. His father asked once where he went. Elias said he was walking. Heinrich didn't ask again, but August followed him one afternoon in June. He was 16 then, with the natural curiosity of a boy who idolizes an older brother. He kept a safe distance among the trees and tracked Elias for nearly 40 minutes until they reached a clearing at the back of the property, near the boundary with the Brandt land. What August saw in that clearing unsettled him enough that he never forgot it, and enough that it took him more than 30 years to tell anyone. He just stood there, August told the journalist in 1928, just standing in the middle of the clearing, staring at nothing. He wasn't praying. I knew what it looked like when someone prayed. He wasn't resting. He was waiting. That's what it was, like he was waiting for something I couldn't see. And the worst part is he stayed like that for so long, so completely still, that the birds at the edge of the clearing stopped making noise. And then everything went quiet, and he kept waiting. August went home before his brother. He never told his father. He never told Elias, but he stopped following him. The summer of 1895 brought a moderate drought and a series of minor disputes among farmers over irrigation and property boundaries. Elias attended a community meeting in August, the last public event where his presence is confirmed, and was described by the town pastor in handwritten minutes as present yet distant, like a man who watches but does not belong. In September, a letter arrived for Elias. The sender was identified only by the initials R.C., and the postmark indicated a town in Kentucky whose name appeared partly illegible in the surviving copies. Heinrich saw the letter arrive. August saw Elias reading it alone on the back porch at dusk. When he finished, Elias folded the paper carefully, slipped it into his vest pocket, and went inside without a word. No one ever learned what the letter said. It was never found. But it was after it that Elias began to change in a way no one could ignore. He stopped sleeping in the barn. He returned to sleeping inside the house. He began asking his father legal questions about a will, about the division of land, about what happened to a man's belongings if he needed to leave for a while. Heinrich answered with the calm of a man who does not want to believe what he is hearing. And in October of 1895, 5 months before he vanished, Elias Voss sat at the kitchen table after dinner and said a sentence to his father and brother that neither of them would ever forget. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a cry for help, it was just one sentence, spoken with the same calm with which he said everything, and for that very reason it sounded heavier than any shout could have sounded. "There's something I saw," he said, "that I shouldn't have seen. And I don't know if I'll be able to stay here knowing it exists." Then he stood, thanked them for the meal, and went to bed. Heinrich and August sat in silence for a long time afterward. Neither of them asked what he had seen, and that question they carried for decades, each in his own way, is the heart of everything that follows. Winter came, and with it, the last months of Elias Voss in Harwick Creek. The winter of 1895-96 was one of the harshest Harwick Creek had faced in nearly 2 decades. County climate records, preserved in meteorological notebooks kept by the local clerk's office, indicate the temperature dropped below 0 in November and did not rise consistently again until late March. Snow came early, in the first week of December, and stayed. Dirt roads became frozen mud. The river along the town's southern edge hardened to the point children could walk on it, and adults forbade it with the seriousness of people who knew exactly what ice can and cannot bear. It was a winter to stay indoors, to feed the fire, mend tools, patch clothes, and wait. Elias Voss spent the nights awake. That is not in official records. It is in August's testimony decades later, indirectly confirmed by Dorothea Meyer's diary, which notes seeing light in the Voss house window on at least 3 different occasions, well past midnight, when the entire town was already asleep. Elias did not say he was awake. In the morning, he appeared for work as usual. But August, who shared the 2nd floor, heard his brother's slow footsteps on the stairs in the middle of the night, and the soft sound of the back door opening and closing in the dark. Where did he go? In that cold, in the middle of the night? The most likely answer, the answer historical common sense favors, is that he went to the clearing. That clearing at the back of the property near the Brandt boundary, where August had seen him standing, motionless, waiting for something that wasn't there. But that is reconstruction, inference from fragments. What is known with certainty begins in March of 1896. In the first week of the month, Elias took 3 actions that separately seemed ordinary. Together, decades later, they would look like the anatomy of a farewell. First, he went to the town hardware store and bought a coil of rope, 2 new bolts, and a box of nails. The owner, Silas Drummond, had no special memory of the day. It was a common purchase. But when he was interviewed in 1902 by a private detective hired by the family, he remembered one detail. He paid in cash, which was unusual because the Vosses always had a tab here, and he asked me not to write it in the book. Second, Elias went to the house of his nearest neighbor, a widow named Agnes Hartwell, and spent nearly an hour talking with her on the porch, despite the cold. Agnes, a woman in her 60s with no children, had known Elias's mother when she was young. In a letter to the town pastor in April of 1896, a letter preserved in the parish archive, she wrote that Elias had spoken about his mother, about childhood, about things he had never mentioned to anyone. He seemed like a man putting his own memory in order, she wrote, as if he wanted everything in the right place before something. Third, on the night of March 6th, a Thursday, Elias sat at the table after dinner, the same table, the same place as always, and wrote 2 letters. One was addressed to his father, the other to his brother August. He sealed them, wrote the names on the envelopes in a firm hand, and left them on the kitchen table under the salt cellar so they would only be seen in the morning. Then he took his coat, his hat, his boots, and he left. It was late, years later. August estimated it must have been around 10:30 at night when he heard the door. He had awakened at the sound, a particular creak he'd known since childhood, and lay in the dark, listening. He waited for the footsteps down the stairs. He waited for the silence that followed. And then he heard something different. It wasn't the usual sound of the back door. It was the front door, the main entrance, which no one used in winter because the wind came from that side, and the draft was unbearable. The front door was only used for formal visits, for Sundays at church, for arrivals and departures that mattered. August said he lay there for a time he could not measure. Then he got up and went to the window of his room facing the road. The night was bright. There was a full moon, or nearly. He couldn't remember for sure, but there was enough light to see the snow on the ground and the footprints leading from the threshold toward the street. Elias was about 50 meters away, walking slowly toward the center of town. He carried nothing in his hands. The coat was the one he always wore, the dark, heavy wool coat he'd worn since coming back from the army. August said he thought about shouting, opening the window and calling his brother's name. He didn't. I don't know why, he told the journalist 30 years later in a voice that still carried the weight of that moment. I only know it didn't feel right. It felt like if I shouted I'd be interrupting something he needed to do. So I watched until he turned the corner, and then I went back to bed. That was the last time anyone in Harwick Creek saw Elias Voss. What came next was reconstructed from 3 independent sources, discovered at different moments over the decades that followed. The first source was the statement of a man named Theodore Ackman, who worked as a night watchman at the train station in the neighboring town of Galion, about 20 kilometers from Harwick Creek. In 1902, when the family hired the private detective, Ackman said he had seen a man matching Elias's description: tall, thin, dark coat, wide brim hat, buying a ticket at the counter around 12:40 a.m. on March 7th, 1896. The destination, according to Ackman, was Columbus. But the train to Columbus had left at 11 at night. The next one would not depart until 6 in the morning. Ackman said the man sat on the station bench for that entire pre-dawn stretch, quiet, staring at the floor. He didn't sleep, Ackman said. He didn't eat. He didn't talk to anyone. When the 6 o'clock train arrived, he boarded without looking back. The second source was a lodging register. In Columbus, at a modest hotel called the Meridian Residence, there was a check-in record under the name E. Voss, dated March 7th, 1896. The guest had paid for 3 nights in advance in cash and requested a top-floor room with a window facing west. The hotel manager, interviewed in 1902, vaguely remembered a quiet man with few requests, who came down for breakfast but rarely for dinner. He wasn't the kind of guest you notice, the manager said, until he becomes the kind you notice because he vanished. On the morning of March 10th, the 4th day, when the 3 paid nights had ended, the chambermaid went to the room. The bed was made. The clothes the guest had hung in the wardrobe were gone. There was no note, no message, but there was something on the table, a photograph. Small, black and white, slightly blurred at the edges, the way photographs of that era often were. It showed a man seated on a wooden chair in front of a simple-faced house. He looked directly at the camera. He wore civilian clothes. He looked calm. On the back, written in pencil, in a hand the manager did not recognize, but that August, seeing a copy decades later, immediately identified as his brother's. March 1896. Everything is fine. The hotel threw the photograph away. A copy survived only because the private detective described it in detail in his 1902 report. The original was found, or found again, decades later inside the cardboard box deposited at the Harwick Creek clerk's office in 1931. How it got there, who deposited it, where it had been after years missing, none of that was ever explained. The third source was the most unsettling of all, not because it said much, but because it said very little, in the most precise and deliberate way possible. It was the letter Elias had left for August under the salt cellar that night of March 6th. The letter to the father, the letter to Heinrich, was never made public. Heinrich Voss died in 1903 without speaking of its contents. The letter went with him, presumably, or it was destroyed. But the letter to August survived. August kept it for the rest of his life, folded inside a hymnal that was among his belongings when he died in 1941. His daughter found it and delivered it to the County Historical Archive in 1956. The letter had 5 sentences. Only 5. August, don't look for me. Not because I'm dead, but because I'm not where you could find me. You were the best brother a man could have without deserving it. Take care of father. And then, below, separated from the other sentences by a larger space than necessary, as though it were a thought he had hesitated to include, but included anyway, what I saw wasn't mine to carry, but it also wasn't mine to tell. Elias Voss was 24 years old, and after that March night, after the 6 a.m. train, the top-floor room with the west-facing window, he simply stopped existing in the records. There was no death certificate, no prison record, no check-in at any other hotel, no other purchase under that name, no other train ticket, no document of any kind in any archive of any American state that states clearly what happened to him, except for one thing. One single thing the private detective discovered in 1902, nearly 6 years after the disappearance, which he noted in his report with the restraint of a man who doesn't know what to do with what he found. In a small town in Kentucky, the same region from which the letter marked R.C. had been sent in September of 1895, there was a land record dated April of 1896, 1 month after the disappearance, listing a buyer identified only as E. Voss of Ohio. The lot was small, a cabin and a strip of land on the bank of a river with no name on the maps. Payment had been made in cash, and the buyer had asked the notary who drafted the deed that the address be kept out of public records. The notary had agreed. and he had complied. Someone had helped Elias Voss disappear, or Elias Voss had helped himself, and whatever he had seen, whatever he had carried since those 4 months of silence in the military records, had been enough for a 24-year-old man to leave everything behind and ask the world to forget him. The question that remained and still remains is this: did he succeed? The morning of March 7th, 1896 began like every other winter morning in Harwick Creek. Heinrich Voss woke before sunrise as always. He went downstairs into the kitchen, put water on to boil, and then he saw the 2 envelopes on the table, beneath the salt cellar, the names written in that firm, slanted handwriting he had known since his son first learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse. There is no record of what Heinrich felt in that moment. He kept no diary. He wrote no letters about it. The only words he spoke that morning, preserved through August's later testimony, were directed at his younger son when he came down for coffee. "Your brother is gone." There was no question in the sentence, no surprise. It was the voice of a man who, somewhere inside himself, already knew. August took the envelope with his name, read the letter, folded the paper, placed it inside the hymnal on the living room shelf, and went to feed the animals. The 2 men spent that day in silence. Only the next morning, March 8th, did Heinrich go to the local sheriff's office, Sheriff Karl Bremer, and report his son missing. Sheriff Bremer was practical, methodical, and not inclined toward drama. His records, preserved in the county archive, show a direct, unadorned approach. He noted the date, Elias's physical description, the last known information, and initially classified the case as voluntary absence of adult. That classification mattered, because it determined how much the state was willing to do, and the state, in 1896, was not willing to do much for an adult man who had left letters explaining he was going away, but the town did. Harwick Creek was small enough that Elias Voss's disappearance became the topic of every porch, every general store counter, every church pew in the weeks that followed. People talked because people always talk, because the mystery of a neighbor is, at once, unsettling and fascinating. Because when someone vanishes from a small community, everyone who remains inevitably begins to wonder what they failed to see. And there was much that had not been seen, or had been seen, but not understood. Mrs. Agnes Hartwell, the widowed neighbor who had spoken with Elias on her porch days before he left, was the first to speak publicly. She did not go to the sheriff, she went to the pastor. And what she told him, recorded in his personal notes, not in the parish's official minutes, was specific enough that he questioned her for more than an hour. Agnes said that during the porch conversation, Elias had mentioned a name. She could not remember the full name, or perhaps did not wish to repeat it. The pastor wrote only that it was a man's name, beginning with R, connected to the army time. RC, the same initials as the letter that had arrived by mail in September. The pastor went to the sheriff. The sheriff wrote it down, and then the trail stopped, because tracking a partial name linked to a military unit whose records had 4 blank months was, in 1896, beyond the resources of a small-town Ohio sheriff. He sent an inquiry to the Department of Military Records in Washington. The reply arrived 6 weeks later. It was a 2-line letter stating that the records of the 3rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Detachment for the period from December 1893 to March 1894 were not available for public consultation due to ongoing administrative procedures. Sheriff Bremer filed the reply, filed the case, and went on with life. It was Silas Drummond, the hardware store owner, who fueled the rumors that spread through town in the weeks that followed, not out of malice. Drummond was an honest man, simply incapable of keeping information that seemed relevant to him. He told at least 4 different people about Elias's unusual purchase: the rope, the bolts, the nails, the cash payment outside the ledger, and each person he told interpreted it differently. Some said Elias had built something he didn't want anyone to know about: a passage, a hiding place, some kind of exit prepared in advance. Others said, in the low and dark tone of people who believe what they're saying, that the rope was for another purpose, the darkest purpose a rope can have. But that theory died quickly, Because the letters Elias left were not the letters of a man ending his own existence. They were the letters of a man carefully reorganizing it. Others still said he had been found, not disappeared, that someone had come to take him, and the departure had been planned between two people for at least 6 months, since that September letter with the initials RC. That theory was the one August considered closest to the truth. He never said it aloud until 1928. But when he finally spoke to the journalist who sought him out for a series on unsolved cases in rural Ohio, he said it with the calm of someone who had spent decades arriving at a conclusion. My brother didn't run from the world. He went into a part of the world he decided was the only place he could breathe. And someone, this R, whoever he was, opened the door for him to get there. The private detective the family hired in 1902, a man from Cincinnati named Frank Holt, experienced in missing person cases, spent 3 months investigating. He went to Columbus, visited the Meridian residence, spoke with the manager, the chambermaid, the station clerk, collected the details about the top floor room, the photograph left on the table, the quiet guest who came down for breakfast but not for dinner. Then he went to Kentucky, and it was in Kentucky that he found the land record with the name E. Voss of Ohio. The notary who had drafted the deed in 1896 had died in 1899, but his assistant, an elderly man named George Peel, was still alive and still remembered. Peel told Detective Holt that the buyer had arrived with someone, not alone, as Elias had been at every other traced stage, accompanied by an older man with gray hair, who did most of the talking during the transaction while Elias stayed quiet, looking out the office window at the street. Holt asked whether Peel remembered the older man's name. Peel said he did. The name was Robert Calloway. R.C. Holt went looking for Robert Calloway, and found not a person, but a trail. Robert Calloway had served in the same unit as Elias, the 3rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Detachment. He was 10 years older. He had been a sergeant, and he had been discharged in September of 1894, the same month Elias returned home. Calloway had moved to Kentucky sometime between 1894 and 1895. There was no fixed address in records, no declared occupation, only a reference in the minutes of a small religious congregation in the interior of the state, dated 1896, listing among its members R. Calloway, ex-military, residing on the property along the Licking River. Holt went there. The property existed. The cabin existed. There were signs of recent occupation, a garden, tools, a stack of firewood cut regularly, but no one was there. The nearest neighbors, nearly 3 kilometers away, said 2 men had lived there. One older, one younger, quiet, polite. They caused no trouble. They bought supplies in town once a month. They did not answer questions about where they came from. Holt asked when they had last been seen. The neighbor thought and said it had been early summer. One day they simply stopped showing up in town. He said he had passed by the cabin once and it was closed, but with the tools in place, the firewood in place, as if the residents had stepped out for a moment and never returned. Holt went back to Ohio, delivered the report to the family. Heinrich Voss read every word with the slowness of a man who needs time to let reality in. Then he folded the report, thanked the detective, and said he would not continue the investigation. August asked his father why. Heinrich answered with a sentence August would repeat to the journalist in 1928, and it is perhaps the most honest and heaviest sentence in the entire file. Because he doesn't want to be found, and I've spent my whole life respecting what my children wanted. I won't stop now. Heinrich Voss died in March of 1903, 7 years after his son's disappearance. The pastor who conducted the funeral noted in the parish register that the service was simple, with few attendees, and that August, the only remaining son, had requested there be no flowers and that the coffin be closed before guests arrived. On Heinrich's grave, alongside the name and dates, there was only one additional line, commissioned by August, father of 4 children. 3 he could hold, 1 he chose to let go. Years passed. Harwick Creek grew slowly, as small towns do. The school gained another room. Silas Drummond's hardware store was sold to a nephew. Sheriff Bremer retired in 1908 and died in 1915 without reopening Elias Voss's case. And then, in March of 1931, 35 years after the disappearance, a cardboard box appeared at the clerk's office. No one saw who left it. The clerk who found it said it was on the counter when she arrived in the morning before opening time. The door was locked. The windows were shut. There was no note explaining its origin, no return address, no indication of who had entered or when. The box contained the worn boots, the bone-handled knife, and the photograph. The photograph of Elias Voss, seated, calm, looking at the camera, with the date March 1896 written on the back. August was called to the office. He was 52 years old. He stared at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then he picked up the knife, examined the bone handle, ran his thumb along the smooth blade. The clerk asked whether he recognized the belongings. August said he did. Then he asked if he could keep the photograph. The clerk said the items had to remain in the archive as evidence of record. August returned the photograph. But before he did, he turned it over one more time, looked at the date, and said quietly, not to the clerk, not to anyone in particular, a sentence she wrote in her personal log that afternoon, uncertain whether to include it in the official file. He was alive in 96. That's all I needed to know. But there was one last question, one no document answered. If Elias Voss had deposited that box at the clerk's office, and the logic of facts pointed silently toward that possibility, then he had returned to Harwick Creek in 1931, 60 years old, or close to it. He had left the belongings, and he had gone away again, without knocking on any door, without saying his name, without asking for anything, only returning what had been his, as if closing an old account, as if wanting someone to know, without having to explain that he had made it to the end. There is a particular kind of silence only archives know. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is not the silence of mourning, nor the silence of waiting. It is the silence that forms between words written on yellowed paper, between the lines of testimonies taken decades after the fact, between the deliberate gaps in records that someone at some point decided not to complete. It is the silence that exists not because no one had anything to say, but because what there was to say was too large, too heavy, too intimate to be trusted to paper. It is within that silence that Elias Voss lived his entire adult life, and it is in that silence that he remains. When I began reconstructing this case a few years ago, what drew me in was not the mystery itself. Disappearances are numerous in archives from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, men and women who simply stopped existing in records, for reasons ranging from tragedy to crime, from mental illness to deliberate, quiet choice. What drew me in was the particular quality of silence Elias had built around himself. It was an engineered silence, planned, executed with the precision of someone who had thought through every detail for months, perhaps years, and concluded that disappearing was the only way to keep existing in a way that made sense. That is not escape, or not only escape. It is a kind of survival the 19th century had no vocabulary to name, but that we, looking from where we stand, recognize with painful clarity. What Elias Voss saw during those 4 blank months in the military records, December 1893 to March 1894, was never documented with precision. It likely never will be. The records of the 3rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Detachment for that period remained classified until 1942, when they were finally opened to the public as part of a broad administrative review of older military archives. What they contained was enough to understand, without needing much imagination. Those months involved operations in disputed territory, under extreme winter conditions, with orders that contradicted the rules of engagement set by the War Department. There were records of confrontations involving civilians. There were casualty lists including names of people who were not soldiers. There were reports drafted in the bureaucratic, antiseptic language of those who learned to describe the unacceptable in terms that make it acceptable on paper. Nowhere in those documents was Elias Voss's name tied to any specific act, but he was there, in the roll calls, in the detachment notes, in the duty register. Soldier, Infantry, present, present. That word, in that context, may be the heaviest in the entire file. He was present for everything that happened in those 4 months. And then he returned to a town of 900 people, to a dinner table with father and brother, to a routine of firewood and fences and animals, carrying inside him something that had no name in his community's language, and would have no name for decades yet. Not until the world endured larger wars, better documented, harder to ignore, and began developing words for what happens to a man when he is forced to witness what men are capable of doing to one another. Elias Voss did not have those words. He had only silence, and the clearing, and the winter night walks in Ohio, and a sergeant named Robert Calloway who survived the same months, who left the army around the same time, who built a life along a nameless river in Kentucky, and who, for reasons that will never be fully known, opened a door for a 24-year-old man to step through and shut the world behind him. August Voss died in February of 1941. He was 62. He married, had 3 children, worked the family farm to the end. He never left Harwick Creek. In his obituary in the local newspaper, preserved in the town's historical archive, there was a paragraph his eldest daughter Emma wrote herself and insisted be included. It was unusual by the standards of the time, but the editor was a family friend and agreed. It read, "August Voss was a man who learned early that loving someone sometimes means letting them go. He carried that lesson through his entire life with a dignity few understood and none of us will ever forget." When Emma was asked years later what the paragraph meant, she said only that her father had spoken of his brother Elias once, on an autumn afternoon when she was 12. He told the entire story, from the return from the army to the box left at the clerk's office, and he ended with a sentence she had kept ever since. "He didn't abandon us," August had said. "He spared us." And it took me many years to understand that those two things can be the same. The cardboard box containing Elias Voss's belongings remained at the Harwick Creek clerk's office until 1968, when the archive was transferred to the Morrow County seat. The boots and knife were catalogued and stored. The photograph was digitized decades later, in 2004, as part of a preservation project for historical documents in rural Ohio. It is that digitized image I am looking at now as I write these pages. A man seated on a wooden chair, in front of a house no one identified, looking directly at the camera with an expression that is not happiness, but not sadness either. Something harder to name, something like the look of someone who has arrived, after a very long walk, at a place where he can finally stop. On the back, written in pencil in a firm, slanted hand, March 1896. "Everything is fine. We will never know what happened to Elias after 1931, whether he lived many more years, whether Robert Calloway was still alive to keep him company, whether he grew a garden, split firewood, woke before sunrise somewhere that wasn't Harwick Creek, and yet was more his than Harwick Creek could ever have been. There is no death certificate under his name in any American state we have been able to trace. There is the possibility he lived under another name, a possibility the records of that era make both plausible and impossible to confirm. There is the possibility he died alone, in peace, in a place whose name we will never know. There is the possibility, remote but not impossible, that there were other returns that left no trace, other quiet gestures toward the people he left behind. We don't know, and perhaps that is exactly what he wanted. What this file leaves us is not a solution. The cases worth keeping rarely have solutions. What it leaves us is a question about what we do with what we carry when the weight is too great to be shared, when the words don't exist yet, when the only exit we can see is through a door that closes from the inside. And it leaves us, too, something rarer than an answer. It leaves us the image of a man who looked at all of it, the weight, the silence, the impossibility of becoming who he had been before, and found somehow in a cabin on the bank of a nameless river, in the company of someone who had seen the same things and survived the same way, a way to continue, not intact, not unscarred, not in the way the town expected, The father expected, the brother, deep down, expected, but to continue. That, in itself, is a kind of courage archives rarely know how to recognize. The town of Harwick Creek no longer exists under that name. It was incorporated into a larger municipality in the early 1950s. The Voss house was demolished in 1963 to make room for a secondary road few people use today. The one-room schoolhouse became a parking lot. The grey stone church still stands, the last original building in town. But the pastor of the current congregation does not know the name Voss and has no reason to. Time does that to stories that were never told out loud. It erases them from places, from stones, from streets, but it cannot erase them from paper. Not completely. Something always remains. A letter folded inside a hymnal, a note in the margin of a diary, a box left on a counter before dawn by hands no one saw. Something always remains. The photograph. Elias Voss was 24 when he disappeared. He had seen things that were not his to carry, but he carried them anyway because there was no choice. He had loved his father and his brother with the restrained silence of someone who doesn't know how to love any other way. He slept in the barn in winter, walked for hours through the hills, stood motionless in clearings while birds stopped singing around him. And in the end, he did the only thing he could do. He chose, not between staying and leaving, but between being lost completely and saving himself in a way no one around him could yet understand. Sometimes the most human thing is not to stay. It is to find the way back to yourself, even if that path leads far from everything you once knew. March 1896. Everything is fine. He said everything was fine. And maybe this time it was true.